Instagram. Yes, we are live. We are live. Okay, Instagram. Love you. Not getting the live stream there. Okay, there it is. There it is. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. It's your girl, Adina, the goddess of magical movement, with the second edition from the third season of the Goddess Technology Podcast. We have an amazing guest here this afternoon. I want to welcome the amazing Alelia Bundles. Let me give a little bit of Alelia's background. Alelia, welcome. Say welcome. Say hello.
Thank you. Delighted to be here with you. Thank you for your high energy.
So happy to have you. That energy is my jam. I am Adina Gittens-Smith, the goddess of magical movement. I am the founder of Goddess Technology and the co-founder of Belly Dancers of Color Collective. Alelia Bundles, if you don't know, she is our honored host. I'm honored to host her today. She is the acclaimed author of On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker. This New York Times best-selling notable book explores the entrepreneurial spirit of her great-great-grandmother. While her upcoming work, The Joy Goddess, Alelia Walker, and the Harlem Renaissance also promises to be an amazing book. This is her great-grandmother, a key figure that helped shape the Harlem Renaissance through her vibrant parties, art patronage, and world travel. Alelia is the co-founder of the Madam Walker Family Archives, which is the largest private collection of Walker memorabilia. She has dedicated her career to preserving the history and advocating for social justice, the arts, and political activism. She has graduated magna cum laude from Harvard College and received her master's degree from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. She's a veteran of network television, and Alelia has lent her expertise to implement this influential platform for over 30 years. Alelia, like I said, welcome. She's earned many accolades, including an Emmy and a DuPont Gold Baton. Today, we're going to discuss the rich legacy of the Walker women and the empowering theme of joy as resistance, with insights from someone who embodies the spirit of a true joy goddess, which is the great-great-granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker. So we are Black history in motion, Black history living. That's what this
Every
is.
day.
Every day. Alelia, I want to tell the story of when I first met you. I was an undergrad at Hampton University, and I was always intrigued by Madam C.J. Walker. For me, and I don't know if you know this, and maybe I shared it back then, but I have always been a natural hair care person. So a natural hair culturalist, coming from the language of Madam C.J. Walker. I do sister locks and I have done braids and things like that all through college and really up until now. So Madam C.J. Walker's story resonated for me, and how she was self-made and how she gave herself a chance, how she says that. So now what I'm doing is working with women in an expanded way, from dance and working with women through Goddess Technology to find and exemplify our magic in our everyday lives, like your great-grandmother did 100 years ago. I recognize her birthday was December 23rd, so she'd be 158 if she was here today. Yay! Shout out.
Right.
Shout out to that. But Goddess Technology focuses on sacred self-care, how important that is, nature, attunement, and ritual, understanding the power of that, goddess consciousness, and then getting into sacred songs and dance, and understanding that if our history and our legacy goes forward, it's going to be us who brings it forward, us who retains it, us who share it. So with that being said, I'd like to just ask you a few questions. Or Alelia, what would you like to say as a opening?
Fire away. I'm ready for questions.
Questions. Ashe. If folks know, or many folks may know, that your book that you wrote was the subject or the inspiration for a Netflix, we'll say, inspired series on your great-great-grandmother's life. And Langston Hughes dubbed your great grandmother as the joy goddess of Harlem. I love that. I love that. So, talk about the Netflix fictional series that's loosely based on your grandmother's life. Just give us your perspective on that as a whole and what you like people to know, because we understand that TV and what we see on the screen is one thing, and what actual reality is another thing as well. So, please share from your perspective.
Yes, we should not believe what we see in a in a TV Hollywood movie unless
Mm-hmm.
it's a documentary. But
That's right.
but what I'd like to start with is who Madam Walker really was, and who
Yes.
and what I think is important about her. And then I can talk about how the Netflix series is not really true.
Okay.
Even though it's very entertaining. But for me, Madam C.J. Walker is a woman who embodies the idea of women empowering other women.
Mm-hmm.
And the brief biography is that she was born Sarah Breedlove in 1867 on the same plantation where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. And in 1867, she was the first child in her family born free. So and it was an area where there had actually been a lot of Black political power in that part of Louisiana on the Mississippi River because it was such a rich cotton growing area. It meant that there was a need for many enslaved people to work that land. So at the end of the Civil War, 90% of the residents of Madison Parish were Black.
Mm.
That translated into Black political power. So her family minister was elected to the Louisiana state legislature as a state senator. So, where we can see, we have this kind of fuzzy idea of what things were like during that period of time, the people just coming out of slavery. And especially now, because we're in a moment where there are people, especially on the right, who want to erase accurate history.
Mm-hmm.
Her family was part of an era when Black political power was burgeoning. But just as we have seen the backlash to Black political power, women's political power, now in the 21st century, that backlash came so that by 1876, the Ku Klux Klan had become more powerful and really had suppressed the vote of the Black people who were in that area. So
Mm.
her brothers and her family minister were essentially escaped from Louisiana because of the political violence. So Sarah Breedlove was left behind with an older sister. And she moved in with her older sister, and she said that her brother-in-law was so cruel, was her word, that she got married at 14 to get a home of her own. She married a man named Moses McWilliams. They had one daughter, Lelia, who later changed her name to Alelia. But when Sarah was 20, Moses died. And so she
Mm-hmm.
moved up the river from St. Louis, I mean, from Mississippi and Louisiana to St. Louis, where her older brothers had escaped essentially a decade earlier. And they had become barbers at a time when Black men dominated the barbering trade. But Sarah Breedlove, no education, moves to St. Louis, and she's struggling, but she becomes part of the community of women at St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. Her brother's barber shop was very near there. So for me, it was the story of these women who were club women, who were school teachers, who embraced Sarah Breedlove because they saw she's a poor washerwoman, doesn't have a lot of education, but she has a drive to make her daughter's life better. And she had a good enough voice to be in the choir. So she joins the choir. She begins to model herself after these more middle class, more educated women. And then ultimately, they mentor her, and she discovers a hair care product. I can talk about that later, but I'll just say the point for me is this idea of a community of women, so that ultimately, when she founded her own business, she turned around and gave back to other women in the same way women had empowered her. Now,
Mm-hmm.
for me, that's the story of Madam Walker, women helping other women. And then she uses that knowledge and that wealth and that sense of community to found a business, to employ thousands of women, to help them create generational wealth, to help them buy homes, to be a philanthropist, to become a political activist, so that when she died, she gave $5,000 to the NAACP's anti-lynching fund. So for me, that is her story. Yes, she became a millionaire, but what's even more important to me is that she used her money and her influence to make a difference for the community. So that's the story of Madam Walker.
That's a
That is
beautiful
true story.
story. Yeah, that's an amazing story. That's not quite the story that we got. And I started thinking that everybody knows Madam C.J. Walker, but perhaps they don't. So that history right there, to understand that she was born on the plantation, the last of her family to be born there, but the first to be born free. She really did exemplify freedom and courage to leave Mississippi with a young daughter. Did she live with family when she went to
Yeah,
St.
when
Louis?
she got to St. Louis, I mean, obviously, and I mean, St. Louis is Missouri is kind of a semi-northern state, but
Mm-hmm.
with southern sensibilities.
Mm-hmm.
But the Black community was very, tightly knit,
Mm-hmm.
and poor in most cases, but it was middle class people, educated people living in the same spaces with formerly enslaved people, laborers, and so they were part of a church community. But yes, for a while she lived with her brothers. She was struggling. She married a man after a few years after she got there, and that was not a good marriage, and so that was, she was still struggling. But she was really surrounded by a community of people who were empowering her. What you got with the Netflix series was something quite different. So I was hoping for Hidden Figures,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like I got Real Housewives of Atlanta. In fact, I was listening to an interview with a longtime feminist, Gloria Steinem, today, and she was being interviewed. And she said, Real Housewives is kind of like women's minstrel shows.
Oh,
And,
wow.
and I know that a lot of people love the drama and Real Housewives of Atlanta, but it's like, women caricatured. And that was
Mm-hmm.
for me a great story, was kind of caricatured.
Mm-hmm.
I will say this: Octavia Spencer was great. I was
She was
thrilled
amazing.
because she sort of, for me, saved it, because she is so powerful and she's such a great actor. And there were many people who were the makeup people, the hair people, the set designers, all of those folks worked really hard. And so I've always been very careful about how I characterize this series. I'm not mad at Netflix. My issue was with the Black women who were the showrunners and the head writer, who really decided that they were going to sort of fabricate a cat fight between two women.
Okay.
And Madam Walker and her competitor, Annie Malone, I mean, they were very much competitors, but they were both very strong women. And I argued with them about making Annie Malone into a drug addict and creating this sort of colorism fight that wasn't really part of their competition, but they were competitors.
Mm-hmm.
But I lost that battle. I mean, I really did try to warn them not to do that.
Right.
And when I had what was called script reviews, so when they had to show me the scripts before they started shooting. I didn't have veto. The author of a book very rarely has veto power, and you do want to allow people to create,
Right.
because Hollywood films, need creativity and creative license. But I just thought they went too far, and I argued with them. The first version of the script they sent me had Madam Walker and Annie Malone calling each other the N word and the B word.
Oh,
And I'm
wow.
telling you, I was like, aghast. So
Yeah.
they dialed that back a little bit, but they weren't willing to dial it back to the point where it really told the real story.
Wow. Well, thank you for giving us that historical ground lay of what it actually was. And so, with understanding that, I want to get into a conversation of joy as resistance, because what these women did really shaped the lives of hundreds of thousands of women beyond what we even really know. Okay. with Langston Hughes dubbing your great grandmother, Alelia Walker, as the joy goddess of Harlem. I wanted to ask you how the essence of joy, how do you articulate the essence of joy? And what do you think the profound role um, joy played in the life of the Walker women coming to success at such a pivotal time in our history and really rising to the top? And we know that that wasn't an easy task. They put it in a lot of hard work, which is what Madam Walker said. It was no crystal stair, was no rose strong path. You know, she worked through it. But how did they exemplify joy for others to see them and see her child and dub her the joy goddess of Harlem? How did she get to joy from
Well,
there?
I think there are a couple of different threads that I would pull on that. One is the role of music and culture and theater for both women, and the other is helping women become economically independent. So let's take the economically independent part first. So, Sarah Breedlove, who became Madam Walker, who founded a business, a hair care products business that provided income for thousands of Black women. This was at a time when most African Americans lived in the South, rural South, working on what had been plantations, labor labor camps, as some people
Right,
now call plantations. Never could get past the end of the season sharecropping, always owed more to the landowner, and were really stuck without education.
right,
And at that period of time when Madam Walker was developing her business, Black people were starting that first wave of a great migration and moving to cities, and people wanted to be economically independent. And she helped provide that by helping women get a go to the Walker School, get a license, and they could hang out their shingle. And they were caring for other Black women. And so just this idea of it caring for women, helping them feel more confident. They were going bald because hygiene was very different at the time. Most Americans did not have indoor plumbing. So for her, it wasn't focused on straightening hair as much as it was on healthier scalps, using her shampoo, her ointment that contained sulfur that healed the infections that were on their scalps because they weren't accustomed to washing their hair very often. So she created that sense of self-confidence, which is, a joy in its own way,
it is.
and this ability to make money for yourself and for your family. So that's one piece of the joy that I think Madam Walker helped create. The other part is music and culture and theater. So even when Madam Walker, Sarah Breedlove, was a poor washwoman in St. Louis, she was in the choir at
Mm.
St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. And people who know the history of the AME Church know the AME Church is a little bit highbrow.
Mm-hmm.
It's the choir director was a classically trained tenor who had performed in operas. He was the an organist, so he was educated. The leadership of the AME Church was more educated than some of the other denominations. And so Sarah Breedlove, with this good enough voice to be in the choir, was surrounded by women who could mentor her. That exposed her. They would go to other churches to sing. The National Association of Colored Women met in her church in 1904 during the World's Fair. So she saw another way of life to which she could aspire. But St. Louis, in addition to this experience with being in the choir, St. Louis had a very large German population. And this was Germans who tended to be more liberal, who had supported the Union side during the Civil War. And they brought their culture from Germany with the beer gardens and the music to St. Louis. There were Black musicians who were training with those German musicians. The Germans ran the music curriculum in the St. Louis public schools, and that the Black elementary schools, the principals often were people who had graduated from Oberlin, which is
Okay.
known for its music curriculum. So you had this collaboration between the German musicians and the Black musicians, so that the Black kids were learning German lieder, and they were learning classical music and hearing opera in school. and there were Black opera singers.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, ragtime was exploding in St. Louis. For a time, Madam Sarah Breedlove and her daughter lived across the alley from Tom Turpin's Rosebud Cafe, which is where Scott Joplin played and
Oh,
did competitions. So you see, this sense of music is
yeah.
very much infused in their early life, so that later, when they became wealthy, they often hosted some of the best musicians of the era. And that for me is where that joy came. That was a bond for mother and daughter. And then they were able to sponsor events and able to help the careers of other African Americans. So many of Alelia Walker's best friends during the Harlem Renaissance were musicians and actors.
That's amazing. The exposure. So moving to up north was really pivotal for Sarah Breedlove in a lot of different ways. And the exposure really helped her. I mean, she took to it because many people were exposed to it and didn't have the same effect that she did. She took that exposure and really expanded upon it. That's quite amazing. I know in reading about Madam Walker, it is said that the formula came to her in a dream. I imagine she worked in her brother's barbershop for a period of time. So there is a hair culture in the family too. And the fact that she's dreaming and getting a formula, that's magical. You know, I believe in magical women. Does she talk more about dreams and what came to her and from that perspective? You know, it's just kind of said, but I'd like to know what your thoughts are as it pertains to her dreaming up this amazing formula. In the series, at one point it was saying that, you know, she had taken the formula from someone else, but she innovated. Even if she used it and made it better, then it's not the same formula, it's
Right.
something
Yeah,
different.
that it's, and I think, there's people, Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein, two of the other big names in cosmetics. Everybody who's in that field seems to have, some kind of magical story and some
Yeah,
kind of myth.
I
And I
love it.
think that's part of the mystique
Mm-hmm.
of it. And I don't doubt that she had a dream. She said, I was so ashamed of my frightful appearance that I prayed to the Lord for a solution. And a big African man appeared to me and told me what to mix up for my formula. Some of the ingredients came from Africa. I sent for them. I mixed them together, applied them to my scalp, and my hair began to grow back faster than it had ever fallen out. So, as I say, I would not dispute that she had that
I
dream,
love
but
it.
I personally think that's probably part of the story.
Okay.
Yes, she had brothers who were barbers. And
Mm-hmm.
so that means yes, there was hair culture in her family. She, for a time, sold products that were made by Annie Malone, who later became her competitor. In the same way that, Tesla and not Tesla the car, but the original Tesla
Nikola
person
Tesla. Mm-hmm.
and and Edison were competitors. And
Right.
Bill Gates and Steve Jobs are competitors. Helena Rubinstein and Elizabeth Arden are competitors. But the truth for Annie Malone is that she wasn't the first person to develop that formula.
Right.
It had been around in pharmaceutical textbooks and medical textbooks for centuries, literally. And it was something very simple: a shampoo to wash your hair, and then an ointment that was like a Vaseline kind of base called petrolatum, with that had sulfur mixed in, and sulfur is a medicinal agent that heals skin infections, and then a perfume that masks the smell of the sulfur, because
Sulfur.
sulfur does not smell good.
No, it doesn't.
But neither Madam Walker nor Annie Malone was the first to come up with that formula. And when Sarah Breedlove McWilliams moved to Denver, she wanted to get away from the second husband, and she was escaping, and she moved to Denver, where she had a widowed sister-in-law and four nieces. She had then sent her daughter to school in Knoxville College, and she's trying to start her life over again. So she's there and she's selling Malone's products, but that's sort of a business on the side. Her main job was as a cook
Mm-hmm.
for a pharmacist named Schultz in
Oh,
Denver, and he had the largest pharmacy west of the Mississippi River.
wow.
And he saw that she was selling these products, and he said, "This is a really simple formula. And there's already Cuticura was already on the market. There were other products already on the market. And he said, you can mix your own formula. And so this combination of her hair falling out, trying to experiment, brothers who were barbers who knew about hair care, selling Annie Malone's products, and then working for a pharmacist who knew how to mix up products. All of those things came together. So yes, she may have had a dream because she was focused on this,
Yes.
but she tweaked it and put some of her own ideas into it. So that's how it really came about. So I I look at the people. There's a lot of stuff on the internet where people are like, "Oh, Madam Walker stole this formula." Well, Annie Malone did not create this formula. It had been around for a
What
long
we
time.
say is nothing new under the sun.
Right.
Okay, it's
But I mean,
nothing new.
and a key for this period of time is that there weren't very many things that were nationally distributed. There were other Black-owned companies that had been around before Annie Malone. There was a couple in Boston, the Johnson, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson in Boston in the 1890s. They had ads in Black newspapers. They were selling the same formula, essentially. But it was this idea of creating a workforce, training women to be your sales agents, giving them a diploma. Madam Walker traveling all over the United States and the Caribbean and Central America to develop a distribution base. So that was the variable.
That was the magic, the marketing, the strategy, the vision. I see her as a visionary to have us be talking about her 148 or 58 years past her birth. That's amazing. That's a
That is
legacy.
amazing.
And you are largely a part of why we know her too, because of your work in genealogy.
But and I mean, and yes, I have definitely spent 5 decades telling this story. But there are a couple of key factors because I could have just not told it. There are many, as you know, there are many family members who have stories. They don't think they're that important, or they don't have the skills to tell it. But I'm a journalist and I've been a writer since I was 8 years old. But my mother was vice president of the Walker Company when I was growing up. My dad was president of another Black hair care company, Summit Laboratories. So I really grew up in a family of people who were selling hair care products. Some of our summer vacations, we went to hair shows. That was,
and that's why your hair looked fabulous too. Look at you.
thank you, thank
The
you,
legacy lives
thank you.
on.
But I was not in any way interested in doing that. I wanted to be a journalist and a writer, and that's what I pursued. And I was more interested in A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, even when I was in high school. But when I was in graduate school at Columbia in journalism, my advisor for my master's paper was a sister named Phyllis Garland, the only Black woman on the faculty, because that was that moment when doors were opening up and finally these institutions of higher learning were hiring Black people to be professors. And Phil and I sat down to talk about my topic, and I gave her some cliched topics. And at the end of the conversation, she said, "Your name is A'Lelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker?"
So
and I'm sure Phil knows
she
the answer to this.
knew.
Yeah,
She
Phil had worked for Jet and Ebony. Her mother had been
Okay.
editor of the Pittsburgh Courier. So,
Okay.
but I was not leading with that. And I said, "Yeah, that's my family." And she said, "That's what you're going to write about." So that was the fall of 1975. And so
Nice.
Phil really was a gift to me to put me on this road to be able to tell the story. And it means a lot to me because it inspires other people.
It really does. It really does. Thank you for that. And I thank you, Phil. I thank you, Phyllis, for having you get back on your path. My mother's birth name is Phyllis, too, if you remember that. So shout out to Phyllis's.
Shout out to Phyllis's.
Yes, shout out. I want to talk about the role of self-care in the community because we're talking about women at the time where it's really hard. And so folks aren't necessarily focused on hair. They're not focused on how they look. They're just really trying to survive. And having Madam Walker come in with a preparation that is really bringing some semblance of joy back to the community where the women are able to feel better about themselves. That happened for Madam Walker. Me as a hair culturalist as myself, I understand that intersection of feeling better and then being able to do more. And also looking at the fact that Madam Walker died at a young age at 51 and Alelia at 46. So they worked hard, but they didn't endure, you know?
Mhm.
So how do we, from your perspective, as Black women and women of color, take this lesson and then have the longevity that we all hope to have, like you were having, and things like that?
Right. No, absolutely. It's they both died young. They both had hypertension.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at that moment, right before some of the real medical breakthroughs were beginning to happen. And so Madam Walker died of kidney failure. But she also was quite driven
Mm-hmm.
and was not slowing down. But, early medical care had not been good. And so by the time her kidneys began to fail, there was not a lot that could be done to reverse it. But she did try, she did have the best medical care available, and she spent time, she made 2 visits to the sanitarium at Battle Creek,
Okay.
which was a place that, only a few Black people went, like
Mm-hmm.
Booker T. Washington and a few others, but she was able to go there to try to have some care and some advice about diet. She also went to a Black spa and baths in Hot Springs, Arkansas. That was a
Mm-hmm.
Black owned place. So she was getting the best available medical care, but it was really too late to reverse this kidney damage. And she found joy with music, with entertaining. She enjoyed her friends. She did do some sightseeing as she was on her business trips. There was always time for seeing the sights. And so I think that, there that to the degree that she was able, but she really was driven. Alelia Walker was trying to carve out her own identity. So because she was definitely overshadowed by her mother. And after her mother's death, and after a really horrible divorce, she really kind of put her foot down and said, I'm going to enjoy myself. Now
Mm-hmm.
she was still working, but she did do more of the making herself get away. Like once a year, she would, at a point, she would go to Hot Springs and she would take a few weeks and try to take care of herself. But again, the high blood pressure was really tough, and she'd had a stroke in
Mm.
1924 from which she recovered. So, and she lived another 7 years after that, and she was, as I say, she was mostly recovered, but she still had that sort of anvil over her head of health.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. That just really makes me think, as folks are striving for whatever they deem as success, self care is paramount. You know, like you do all of this, you build all of this, but you want to enjoy your life for as much as you can. Madam C.J. Walker said something about women's duty to women. What do you see that as today? What's our duty to each other?
Mhm. Well, she was seeing it. She made a sort of a series of speeches across the country, and at that point, she was really talking about women who had some education and who had some privilege, being able to look out for others. She was the women of the National Association of Colored Women, a national club women's movement, had a great influence on her, and their motto was lifting as we climb.
Mm-hmm.
And so she really did see this. She knew that she had benefited from other women reaching out for her, encouraging her, lifting her up. And she saw that as her duty. When she, in 1917, at her first national convention of the Walker sales agents, she told the women in her keynote speech, I want you to understand that as Walker agents, I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others. And at the end of the convention, and she said, and your first duty is to humanity. So
Mm-hmm.
she wanted them to realize that now that they were making some money, they needed to be leaders in their communities. They needed to give back. They needed to help charities in their communities. And so she was really set on that. But in addition to this sort of personal family and immediate community, she also saw the bigger picture, the more political picture. So at the end of that convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. So she really saw this army of women not just helping themselves and their families, but their communities and Black people around the world.
That was beautiful. I read that telegram that she sent to the president. And for folks to realize that, okay, you think washerwoman, you think hair culturalist, and you think influencer of the president to actually make lives better for everyone around this country at the time, living up to the country's best possible emanation of itself. When she said, we are patriots, I thought that was really interesting for Black women to really classify themselves as patriotic at that time. Like, we love our country, but the country is not loving us back. This is what we need. And it was really powerful to see that. In the movie, the Booker T. Washington character really talked about, not like, I felt like the sexism was a piece. Like, okay, women had to deal with racism, sexism, poverty, that kind of thing. And so the Booker T character in the movie was saying he didn't really support the women being a part of Madam Walker's hair culturalists because they'd make more money than their husbands, and then that would upset the order of the family. Was that fiction?
Yeah, that, I mean, this is I'm just like trying not to roll my eyes because it's so wrong.
Okay. Because see, as a graduate of Hampton University, Booker T, Hampton has a relationship with Booker T. Washington. And so then I felt the way about Booker T. I was like, how you going, Booker? Really? That's how you're doing it?
That's why I'm saying it was a caricature. It was a cartoon. It was not nuanced.
Okay.
And I think that this does a disservice to other Black people when you use stereotypes and cliches.
It does.
As opposed to trying to find some way to tell a story with some context and nuance. So look, yes, in some ways, Booker T. Washington was a man of his times. And so there was some sexism at work. But you have to put in perspective, his wife, Margaret Murray Washington, was the dean of girls at the school. She was a very strong, independent woman. She had been president of the National Association of Colored Women. She was highly educated. Right. The way that they portrayed the women as the members of that organization was, thank goodness Madam Walker let us come out of the kitchen. Right. That was so not true. These are women. Some of them, the leadership had studied in Europe.
Powerful
These were not women who were like hankering to just be in the kitchen. So that was wrong. And then that scene where, Booker T. Washington is telling her that was just not true. It never happened. And there's a much more, an actual factual confrontation between Madam Walker and Booker T. Washington. I don't understand why they didn't just use the words from the speech that she actually gave, because we have the real words, where she was at the convention and he wouldn't let her speak. And she stood up and she said, surely you're not going to shut the door in my face. I'm a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. And from there, I was promoted to the wash tub. And from there, I was promoted to the kitchen. And from there, I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations. For me, that's much more dramatic.
That's powerful. Like, I feel tingly from that.
They wanted to tell a different story. And, yes, Booker T. Washington, he and Madam Walker had a complicated relationship. Ultimately, there was mutual respect. But this idea that he was saying, the women are going to make more than the men, that just was just a lie. I mean, I just don't know what else to say.
Right. Well, if the women are making money and we're able to have homes and the kids are able to be in school, then we all win. We all win.
Right.
When we think of feminine power and leadership, how did the Walker women's journey reflect the movement of women into the seat of power? They really were early on making some changes, but how do you see it reflected today? Like, things have shifted in a lot of ways, but at the same time, we're still coming up against some pushback as we look at the last election. you know, some, but to even be at a place to have that election is some
It's
forward
progress.
movement.
It's, well,
Yes.
listen, for that during that time, it just this is why it's for me, it's so important that we learn history and read as
Mhm.
much as we can, because the way that we learn history and the way that history is being erased, we don't really understand the context of what our great grandparents and great great grandparents were experiencing. But during that period of time, again, most Black people were still living in the rural South. The jobs that were open to
Mhm.
Black women were being a washerwoman, a cook, a maid, a domestic, a farm worker. And so Madam Walker was there were a few school teachers, a few nurses, but Madam Walker was providing economic opportunity for women. But it was also at a time where Black men were underemployed. You could work as a laborer. If you were doing something else, there were a few doctors, there were a few lawyers, there were a few teachers and people who were professors, a few. So the economics for the Black community was really quite different. So most Black women worked, whether
Mhm.
it was you were picking cotton in the field or whether you were washing clothes, somehow you were contributing. So that part was not new for us. Now, there were people who, sort of the goal was for a Black woman not to work outside the home. That's a different scenario for white women because most Black women had to work. And so
Mhm.
in some households, it was a sign of privilege to not have to work outside the home. But what Madam Walker did, if a Black woman was widowed, there was no, safety net for people, and so they had to work. And so she really made that possible. But that then helped to create generational wealth for Black families, allow people to buy homes. Now, what they didn't plan for was redlining that made those Black neighborhoods where people bought homes be worth less than they should have been.
Mhm.
But she also focused on that economic independence for women. And one of the things that I love knowing about that legacy, a good friend of mine, Tiffany Gill, who is a professor at Rutgers, wrote a book called Beauty Shop Politics, where
Mm.
she looks at the role of Black women who were making their own money, buying their own homes, having their businesses, being involved in their communities, and how they were empowered to become politically active. So when Madam Walker had that convention in 1917, those women saw a role for themselves in politics. And then through the next decades, what became the National Beauty Culturist League was a combination of Black women beauticians from all over the country who had national conventions. And they were always, they were involved in politics. Um, Martin Luther King always came to their conventions in the 1950s. And what Tiffany Gill's research showed is that the women who were beauticians helped to pay for the buses that took people to the March on Washington in 1963.
I
Of
love
course,
that.
A. Philip Randolph was the key organizer along with Bayard Rustin, and his wife, Lucille Green Randolph, was a Walker trained agent. So, this combination of Black women, economically independent, politically involved, it has seeds with Madam Walker.
That's amazing. I love to know that. I didn't know that they were that involved in the civil rights movement, but it was a grassroots movement, so it made sense. And as
Right, and
philanthropic,
where are you going every week? You're going to the beauty
going to
shop,
church. Yeah.
and
Hmm.
there's again, Tiffany's research shows that when the churches became too much of a target, that sometimes the meetings would happen in beauty shops and barber
Hmm.
shops.
Beauty
And
shops,
there's one
barbershops.
scene she describes where one of the women, and I can't remember her name, but who was demonstrating after she'd had, mustard thrown on her head and salt thrown in her eyes, she went to the beauty shop and they laid hands on her.
Mm, okay, so that's more magic. I love that. I love that. So I know Madam Walker traveled the United States selling her preparation, telling people about it. She really championed her own cause. So she traveled more domestically, but she really was working a lot. And Alelia, you mentioned that she had an opportunity to travel, going to Ethiopia and going to Paris and London and places like that. How do you feel the travel impacted their view of the world? Did they take their preparations when I know Madam did domestically, but when Alelia traveled, did she travel more kind of from a diplomatic perspective? Was she working? Was it more recreation? How was she seen as kind of American royalty, African
Right.
American royalty coming out?
Right.
Talk about the travel, the
Sure.
transformation and the
So
travel.
I would say, well, Madam Walker did travel domestically, but she also went to Jamaica, Haiti, Costa Rica, Cuba, and Panama in
Wow.
1913. And
Okay.
she made that trip with a black opera singer, because the black opera singers had traveled internationally. So she already she knew how to navigate this particular person had traveled to Europe, and she traveled to South America. So she was Madam Walker's guide in some ways of getting her on that first leg of the trip.
Are
But
they
at that,
flying? Are they on a boat? Like, how are they
yeah,
traveling?
they're in a boat. Yeah, I mean, at
Okay.
that point, it's 1913, so it's a
Hmm.
boat.
Wow.
Um, but yes, she was definitely going to try to expand her business in those countries, because obviously the African diaspora is, there are many people who need her products from her point
Hmm.
of view. And then later in 1917, Alelia Walker went to Cuba, where her mother had gone, and so she was developing new territory there. And then in 1919, Alelia Walker and my grandmother May traveled from the United States. They went to Panama. They really had on their itinerary several other places in Central America and South America. But while they were traveling, Madam Walker died. But the idea initially had been to expand the business in Central America and South America. Then later in 1921 and 22, Alelia Walker traveled to Paris, London, Monte Carlo, Nice, Rome, Naples, Addis Ababa, Cairo, Palestine, and
Mm.
Alexandria, Egypt. And it was a combination of sort of getting over a bad marriage. She was needed to clear her head. And there was some thought that she was going to do some sales. She had been invited to Liberia by the president of Liberia, who she had entertained at Villa Lawaro a year or so earlier.
My father's Liberian. My father's from Monrovia.
Is that right? Well,
Yeah.
so CDB King, who was the president, had made a trip to the United States in 1921, trying to get the U.S. government to give the balance of a loan they had promised him during World War One. So he came to
Mm.
meet at the White House. They really just dissed him and did not give the money.
He
But
didn't get his
while he
money.
Right, it was his money, because
Oh
he
my
had been,
goodness.
that Liberia been had sacrificed during the
Hmm.
war. But he had invited Alelia Walker, but while she was in Europe, he sent word that it wasn't a good time to come, and so he had been that once that loan had been turned down and he returned to Liberia. I think it was just there was too much uncertainty, so she ended
Mm.
up not going to Liberia, though she
Okay.
had wanted to expand the business there.
Wow, that's amazing. That's really amazing. Um, you talked about um, the lessons really from their lives. And I'm thinking really about Alelia now, because I know that's your next book, The Joy Goddess of Harlem, coming out in June. Let's delve into her a little bit more. I think it's amazing that she was so worldly and expansive, even taking the business to Harlem at that time where things were, it had to be like being in some place magical, coming from where they had come from Indianapolis and definitely Mississippi, from where Madam Walker came from. Um, Alelia and the Dark Tower and all of those amazing parties, and the really, you could be in there getting your hair done and with royalty from all of Black history.
Mhm.
Talk to me about what you envision sitting in Alelia's chair, probably not Alelia's chair, but the people working there's chair, because she is the goddess who is schmoozing everybody. That's how I see her, just kind of schmoozing it up. What was the atmosphere like at the Dark Tower in the 20s?
Right. So, just a little, a little bit of context in when Madam Walker was developing this business. So she's in Denver in 1906, and she and her new husband, Charles Joseph Walker, want to continue to expand the business. So Amelia moves to Denver to run the mail order operation. Then Madam Walker and C.J. Walker travel throughout the South and the Southwest developing the company. She settles briefly in Pittsburgh. And then she decides she wants to move to Indianapolis because Indianapolis is a great place if you have a mail order business because of all the trains that are coming through, the distribution that's possible. And so when she moved to Indianapolis, she put Alelia in charge of the Pittsburgh operation,
Okay.
which meant Alelia's territory was Pennsylvania, New York, and the East Coast.
Okay.
And as Alelia visited New York and as they visited New York together, they could see that Harlem was really becoming the center of Black culture and politics.
Mm-hmm.
And so Alelia persuaded her mother that they needed to have a presence in Harlem. So now the business is headquartered in Indianapolis beginning in 1910. And in 1913, Madam Walker buys a building on 136th Street. And Alelia hires Vertner Tandy, the first licensed Black architect in New York, to design this beautiful townhouse. The first floor is the Walker Beauty Salon, which is luxurious. You talk about joy and self-care. It
Mm-hmm.
was that. The beauty school was in the basement, and then the living quarters that had an organ and grand piano and a harp were on the up was on the second floor, and then the living quarters were upstairs. So Alelia Walker was creating this beautiful space. Ultimately, Madam Walker moved her personal residence to New York in 1916, and they were entertaining again some of the most famous musicians of the era. Whenever they had a party or a dinner, there was always live music. Then Madam Walker dies in 1919, and Alelia is still very much running the New York office, relying on people in Indianapolis, the attorney, the general manager, the staff, the factory staff, to run the business. But she's carving out something different in Harlem, and people come to her because they think she has money and they want her to be the sponsor, or they want her to contribute to this and that. And that's when she really begins to carve out this identity as a person who is a patron of the arts. So she has dinners and parties, and then she starts renting out some of the spaces in the townhouse. She gets an apartment a few blocks away because there's too much commercial activity in the
Right.
townhouse. But that's sort of becomes the place where a bridal shower, a wedding, a sorority, a fraternity has a dance. And that really starts it. And then in 1927, she has this idea of really wanting to help the careers and the creativity of Black writers. And that's when the Dark Tower opens.
That sounds amazing. Absolutely amazing. So, as we're thinking about women today, here we are, 2025, 100 or so years later from when the Dark Tower opened. How can we glean, or what do you envision the legacy of the Walker women in inspiring ongoing conversations about joy and beauty and resistance in future generations? How can, because joy I see as resistance, because coming out of slavery, you wouldn't have thought that we would find joy. You know, you think it's just, we're just shrouded in sadness and struggle and trying to live. But not only did we live, we thrived. You know, Alelia thrived, Madam C.J. Walker thrived. The men and women supported each other. I love seeing C.J. Walker support his wife in this vision of becoming of all that it became. So how do you see future generations, and as we as magical women remember the shoulders that we stand upon, how can we have these ongoing conversations about joy, beauty, and resistance and keep this alive for future generations and expound upon that? What do you see?
Well, no, I love what you're doing and helping women sort of be in touch with their bodies and be in touch with the joy that comes from knowing your bodies. Because, there are a couple of things that happen with us when, if we are depressed, or if we don't think that there's any way beyond our circumstances of the moment, then we may just sit still. And we're not using our bodies. We're not getting those endorphins going. We think, oh, I don't like to exercise. So we put ourselves in a space where our health is affected because we're not exercising, because we're not eating properly, because that kind of cycle of depression just leads to not taking care of yourself. So we abandon self-care. So I think it has to start with us. I mean, I go to the gym every day.
Nice.
I and now it's the point where I have to do it because I don't feel right unless I do it. But that's a muscle that one has to exercise. Now everybody's not going to go every day. And then when I travel, no, I don't go every day when I'm on the road. But that idea of getting those endorphins, moving your body, making sure you're not stiff, making sure you have good balance as you get older, that's just really important. And I hope that people will prioritize that. And admire what you are doing. The other thing is just sort of what my mother used to call good mental hygiene. It's like, make sure you're not surrounded by people who are toxic. And sometimes, there's some people in our lives we can't entirely get away with, but minimize that amount of time that you spend with them. I'm really blessed to have great girlfriends, great friends, male friends too, but your girlfriends are always there. And it's important. And I have had to, excise a couple of folks because it's like,
Understood.
what? I'm not dealing with that. But I also make sure that I am really informed about what's going on. And I know a lot of people are tuning out right now. The election was very painful for people, and they're like, I'm done. I'm not doing anything else. But I don't feel like I have the luxury to tune out. One of the things that keeps me going, I mean, I read a lot of current events, but one of the things that is relatively new in my, diet of being informed is Sherilyn Ifill's Substack. So many people know Gwen Ifill, the journalist, the
Yeah,
late
the
journalist.
ancestor. Yeah.
Gwen's cousin Sherilyn,
Okay.
Sherrillyn, Ifill, Ifill,
Okay.
was for many years the director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So she was fighting the hard civil rights legal battles, and she is brilliant. She moved on from that position. The NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, unlike a lot of organizations where the same leader stays for 50 years,
Right.
they have always had a good succession plan. So there's now another person, Janae Nelson, who is the head of that. But in this new phase of Sherilyn's life, she is doing lots of lectures. She's writing a book, and she started writing this Substack. So people who may not be on Substack, if you Google Sherilyn's name, or if you go substack.com, I really encourage you to read it. Her latest one is on, I think it's called, Trump here. So this is it, Trump 2.0. How do we deal with it?
Okay.
And she starts off with, we're at the precipice. Now, what do? We need to keep ourselves informed, but we also need to hold each other's hands.
Right.
We need to commune together. We need to keep each other's spirits up because we don't have the luxury of giving up.
And that's what we had. It was always us with us. For me, I said, I'm not dependent on what happens in Washington per se. I'm looking at women's duty to women, our family's duty to each other. We are why we survive. We're why we're here right now. So put it in perspective. We don't have to let it poison the next 4 years for us because we've gone on through much worse. So I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that. Going forward, honoring and paving the way, how can we honor the legacy of the Walker women and simultaneously pave the way for joy and empowerment? You said a little bit of that with Sherilyn's what is it, a blog Substack? It's a Substack. Okay, we can of course take a look at that. What do you see us doing personally? How can we honor what Madam and Alelia has left for us, the breadcrumbs?
Well, for me, it is telling the stories. And it's,
Mhm.
I tell my family story, but I want to encourage others to learn their family stories.
Yes.
Make sure that if that you are interviewing the oldest person in the family, getting their stories, being patient with them if they're not ready to tell you. But your children and their grandchildren have those phones, and they can pull those phones out every time they see grandma or Aunt Sarah, whoever, and
Mhm.
say, talk to me for 5 minutes. Just tell me a story for 5 minutes. And over time, you accumulate that. So I really do believe our stories are our power. And we find that we have warriors in each generation. And that do not let someone tell you you do not have a history. It's incredible to me that at 72 years old, a person who has seen for the last 50 years, all of these doors open up, all of the opportunities that I've been fortunate to have, whether it was in education, whether it was in my career, whether it's other opportunities in writing the book. I feel fortunate that those things have been available to me. I am concerned that the generations coming after me are having these doors closed. And so I feel an obligation to try to keep those doors open.
Ashe. Well, let's open the doors to some movement on that. Okay. As the goddess of magical movement, I love to dance at the end of my podcast. We're going to dance from the waist up in the spirit of what you just shared. We are opening the doors. We don't have to have somebody open them for us. Let's see if you can hear this. Can you hear that, Alelia?
I can.
Come, give me some movement, mama. Yes. We're in the dark tower. Langston is there. Your grandmother's there. We're getting our hair done. We're drinking champagne. It's fabulous. Yes. Thank you for your time. I love you. I appreciate you. And thank you for telling your story and encouraging us to learn our own.
Thank you very much for having me. Happy
Yes.
New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year. All righty. I ended the stream, I think.